Welcome to the Regenaissance Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Griggs. Visit www.theregenaissance.co to learn more. Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Griggs. I'm the host of the Regenaissance Podcast. Alongside me today is Rich Bradbury from Carn, Grassfed Cattle. Thank you for joining me.
Yep, it's a pleasure.
So I guess to get started, I found you on LinkedIn, and actually I've been using LinkedIn more, and it's been great seeing, especially with agriculture, but regenerative agriculture and just the whole culture on LinkedIn has been amazing. And I've seen that you have been with Carn Grass Cattle since '93. And I'm curious, did you grow up in the world of agriculture, or what led you to starting Carn Grass Fed Cattle?
Yeah, I did. I say 93 because that's when I bought my first three Beefmaster heifers, which is I wrote about it. It's a breed that was completely founded in the United States by a gentleman called Tom Lassiter, who was a sort of a Renaissance man himself in cattle raising, and he chose the cattle for six distinct traits. Uh, but like the color of the hide or what they look like weren't those. It was like mothering ability, milking ability, disposition, conversion. I always get them screwed up, but it didn't matter what they looked like. So they didn't have to be black. They could be white and black. White. There's all sorts of beautiful Beefmaster colors. As the breeds progressed, it sort of turned to sort of a light red. But um, so yeah, I think I've always been sort of focused on regenerative agriculture through ranching, and I've been exposed to ranching all my life. And we were doing holistic resource management. My family, my parents went to a savory school in 1986 in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Wow.
And when they came back from that, it sort of changed their paradigms. And because I was probably 11, that changed. Just it was something that I grew up with. So I didn't have to make any big paradigm shifts to see that because that's the way I evolved. And so I always say that I inherited a regenerative legacy. I mean, I keep working towards regenerative goals because there's always little tweaks and nudges that you can make. But even long before my parents went to the savory school, our ranch was very holistic. My grandfather was very sort of let nature take its course type of guy. And we like to talk about regenerative and all these big grand schemes, but really the places that were the most regenerative were the places that didn't have any money. And it made people be resourceful with the resources they had. And it lessened the amount of cultivation. It lessened the amount of that chasing after cash crops because you were just managing the resources you had. You were sort of on a shoestring, or you were in these remote locations like we are. We're in one of the most remote places in the lower 48 states.
Hmm.
So we couldn't even bring a lot of products to us that would have pushed us out of that regenerative thing. So um, I'm very dedicated to the regenerative. I've been studying it since 2014. I've been indoctrinated in this savory, holistic thinking, but I wouldn't say that I'm sort of standing on the back of other people that made smart choices long before me.
I'm curious then, going back to your grandfather, um, do you know how he was, I guess with that thinking, how that came to be, especially in the culture at the time to where it typically was more, I guess, quote unquote, conventional. And then especially leading into your parents' generation as well. Is there anyone he learned that from, or what made him decide on how he went about it with agriculture and ranching?
So most of my family came in through San Francisco. So my grandfather would have been the firstborn child in the United States from Ireland. And they migrated, they would work around San Francisco and put together a little sheep herd, and then they would migrate southeastern part of Oregon. Homestead had set something up. So I think very much my grandfather's father probably arrived in the place that I live now. He was probably in his 30s or later. He'd put in a tremendous amount of work, and my grandfather, being his son, they very much had to carve their ranch out of the frontier, basically, because even though it was the 1800s, early 1900s, it was still very much not civilized or not. There was no real infrastructure to just come in and create a ranch. So he didn't have the same burdens. He was able to take that. Like I said, they didn't have any money. They were trying to create something out of nothing or something great, but put a human touch and a business in it. And so I think that just came from just not having the resources that they'd have if they were in a place with more infrastructure, a town. He would uh, he would get on a horse and ride 6 or 7 hours so he could go to a barn dance, and then he would ride back in the middle of the night. So they were long ways from even basic city services.
Dang. Okay, so I guess then fast forward to 1986, where your parents with Alan Savory, how were they able to discover him and everything that he was doing at that time?
Um, I don't know what brought them to Savory. I think that was some of their. I want to say it was somebody that they were working with at the BLM, and Savory had this weird relationship with academics and agencies, where he's gone from heretic to hero. I mean, in the 90s, if you talked about Savory in college or around a range class, they would say, well, he doesn't really, his thing does isn't applicable in all places. Well, nothing's applicable in all places, but any, and he doesn't like to use the word framework or system, but any type of outlook on agriculture like Savory's is pretty applicable across. And I would say um, that he's influenced the Saltons, the Browns, a lot of people that are the leaders in regenerative agriculture in some way, maybe not as exclusively, but you can see that holistic mindset in those type of operations like White Oak Pastures and a lot of the new and up and coming ones. The co-op my family started in '86. They founded it with 6 other people, or they had all gone to that Savory Institute, independent from each other. And they started a co-op in Oregon, and um, it used that holistic thinking system. It was consensus based, where they didn't move forward until everybody agreed. Um, it's it's an interesting perspective that isn't as linear as where we find people in conventional agriculture. And there's no problems with those type of systems. That hierarchical system is really great for some people, and a more flat, decentralized uh, hierarchy sometimes works better. I think for a bunch of independent, strong-minded ranchers.
And then with you growing up there too, and the fact that mentioning having this land after your great grandfather, or yeah, great grandfather leading to your grandfather, and then your parents with Alan Savory, and just being ingrained in this holistic management. What was that like growing up for you on that ranch? And I'm
So
just
we don't.
curious. Oh, go. I'll let you go ahead.
It was interesting because it was a large ranch, and we sort of ran into a tragedy of the commons situation. And because we were the odd actors in this large family, we were the ones that, after a long legal battle, got kicked off because we were the square hole and the round hole that had to fit into, or the round peg that had to fit into the square hole. My mom loves to tell this story. We had this field that was sort of in lower next to a lake, and it grew a tremendous amount of feed. And their tradition is in the little community that we're at that most of all the wetlands and the pasture lands they get hayed, and the cattle go out on rangelands, and then that hay gets fed back to the cattle when they come back in the late summer and fall. Um, my dad and my mom decided that rather than hay a field, they bank all that feed and then bring the cattle back to it, and it just drove our family partners absolutely insane that we would do something like not hay that field, and they were absolutely um, sure that we were destroying it because we were following that common practice. Well, my youngest sister did a science project on it, measured one of the very first soil tests that I had ever been exposed to, and where somebody did it themselves. It wasn't a government thing. And just over a matter of 2 or 3 years, the organic content of that field had been picked up significantly. Now, granted, it was already high. That system of haying a field and then feeding that feed right back on that hay is a really interesting cycle. I do think the actual cycle that's better is to eat that plant while it's still in the ground.
Can we talk about the two different ones then? The one you're mentioning with how the hay was, and then the cows with eating
Yeah.
it. Okay.
So I guess I'm not sure what. How do you want me to approach it?
Just, I guess, help explaining exactly just the whole process of how you were saying with just growing the hay and whatnot for the listener that might not understand, um, even just the world of hay too, because that's a big proponent of agriculture too.
Yeah, there's a lot of confusion about hay, and it. Wow. We'll start with the different ways that you could do it. So, a lot of ranches are, and this goes back to what we were talking about prior to the podcast. There's only a limited amount of water in the West where a lot of the ranches are. That water tends to accumulate in valleys and watersheds and these long river systems or lake systems. And what happened when ranches or the homesteading happened, irrigation systems were put up and they were flood irrigated. And it was basically ours, the stuff that we graze probably is a lot of the native stuff that was already there. There might have been some stuff planted over time, but just mostly that native crowded it out. It's back. But it's also really a good, um, you can let it grow, you can hay it, you cut it down, bale it, harvest it, and stack it, and then feed it back to the cattle in the winter when the feed's not good. The other option is you leave it standing, and then you bring the cattle to the feed standing. You supplement them with a really good mineral program, and you don't hay it, and then they mash all that organic matter down, and they do what cattle do. They defecate and they urinate on stuff, and they basically create that organic matter that's going to put the nutrients back into the soil. Now it happens with the haying system, but you're not mashing that organic matter in. You're not leaving that intact root system. You're not. There's a lot of things that aren't happening when you hay it because you sort of cut that plant's life off in late June, July, early August, and there's so much that happens with that plant if it just stays in the ground. So much stuff leaches back into the soil after it's grown, and the protein in the plant, the longer it's given to grow, the more healthy, the more nutrients that plant pulls out of the ground.
Hmm. Very interesting. And then I guess going back to the stories too of with your parents and losing land, is did I hear that correctly too? That so I guess because this is another interesting thing too with just land as a whole. Because I also saw recently in Texas, there's potential with a lot of, I think it's 200,000 acres of private land that could potentially be taken in the name of mitigation. And so there's all kinds of scenarios dealing with land because land is very important, obviously, especially in the context of agriculture. So again, I guess what exactly happened and why did it happen to where you lost the
It,
land?
it wasn't so much the we didn't lose the land. We
Oh,
just
okay, I
can't
see.
operate it. We can't operate on the land. There's too many people, too many families.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So my grandfather and his brother both had. My grandfather had four kids, and his brother had seven kids. And they wrote a lease in such that anybody could come back and operate on the ranch. Um, but the partners couldn't get along, and for different reasons, they didn't like each other, and somebody had to go. There was a long legal battle, and my family's the one that got the boot. So, and that's not something that we. How would you say it? It was in the long run. It seemed terrible at the time, but it was a really good thing. Um, so in the same area, my folks in '93, before we got kicked off with I think it was the early 2000s, had purchased some land 19 miles away from where my grandfather's ranch was, and a really great water system, fed by two watersheds, and a great range permit, federal permit that went with it. So it was really good all around operation. Um, and we'd been already operated, so we just made the transition there. It wasn't quite financially, it couldn't quite it wasn't serving the purpose of like a whole ranch for us. We had to do some tweaks. So my folks ended up going to Nevada and leasing a ranch from a mine that was using that for environmental mitigation for mining that they were doing somewhere else. So the idea of the ranch there was that they'd lease it to somebody that would run it. And this was also before regenerative, but with that sort of regenerative philosophy and mitigate what they were doing with the mining just a couple valleys over. And it was the very first time that a lot of people had lost a lease because they didn't put in the environmental component that the mine was looking for. And my folks did. They partnered with a guy that does radio spectrum analysis of grazing lands. And he was doing it when we partnered with him. He was doing it with a paraglider and pictures. Now he can pull up a satellite and show the changes in the grazing just based on the radio spectrum of the satellite. And it's been incredibly beneficial in the things that and what happened is my sister, my middle sister, she and her husband run that ranch, and then 10 years later, we took the opportunity to take another lease in Northern California around the Bay Area and leased the Contra Costa Water District. And once again, the reason that we got the lease is it's not because we gave the best price, but we added that environmental component to the lease. And since it was a publicly run agency for the greater good of the watershed of the Bay Area, they liked that environmental component, and nobody else had shown them that, even though they'd been asked. So um, we come back full circle, and my sister's in Nevada, my other sister's here in California, and I'm here in Oregon. And my parents run their cattle in all three places.
So with the one mentioning finding the land 19 miles away, I guess this is just a general question for folks that might just be interested in looking for land, either to lease or to buy for homestead or ranching. What are some crucial? Because you mentioned water, having two. I think you said two watersheds.
Yes.
What I guess just what are some crucial things that folks should look into whenever looking at a piece of land?
Well, now you're in my wheelhouse.
Good.
So my other thing besides ranching is I do real estate because there. I don't know if you ever heard of a newspaper. It's big in ranching. It's called the Western Livestock Journal.
Mm-hmm.
It's about everything. Well, every quarter it puts out a like a Sears wish book called Properties. It's every ranch across the western United States, and they're all beautiful. And ever since I was a kid, and this would come in the mail, I was just fascinated with ranch land, real estate, and just to have this thing come and just sort of imagine myself at all these different places that you'd see in this real estate magazine. It was blew my mind. So I got into real estate, really started thinking about I got into commercial real estate first, and I really started thinking, why are ranches not marketed like commercial real estate? It's a commercial type of entity. It has a certain amount of value. It's not like residential real estate. One of my real estate buddies from Montana says that it's like every fly fisher in the off season sells ranches. They might not know anything about ranchers, but that's what they do. And forever, there's not very there's a lot of people that say that they ranch that in ranch real estate, but there's not very people that actively ranch or really ranch on any scale. And there's a lot of stuff that goes into the value of a ranch. And this has been something that I've been working on since 2020. Yeah, 2020. So 4 years, really um, breaking apart what gives a ranch a value. And my initial assumption was that one of the most underestimated things on a ranch value, or something that can cause it to look really expensive when it should be much cheaper, is the ratio of water rights to overall acreage. You can get a huge ranch, say 3,000 acres, and it won't have a lick of water rights, but they'll still call it a ranch. My theory is you should have that. If your ranch is at like 25% or above in covered by water rights, then your resiliency is not very high. So water allows you to be very resilient and to be very robust, but no water puts you in a really bad place. And I've been learning about a lot of mitigation things you can do. You could do swales, you could do ponds. There's a lot of ways you can develop water, but starting with, if you're going to buy a place, start with a good set of water rights, 25% and above, and you're going to be in good shape. And the amazing thing is, like, so many ranches sell because of their aesthetic value. I've seen beautiful ranches that sell that have like 600 acres and 12 acres of water rights. I mean, aesthetically, they're pretty, and they sell for gobs and gobs of money because that's sort of that Yellowstone, that Ponderosa thing that people have in their mind. They want this beautiful storybook ranch.
Yeah.
And then you'll have a ranch that has 78% water that been sitting on the market for 3 years and nobody's ever touched it because it doesn't have that aesthetic appeal. But it offers you resilience and an opportunity to grow many crops and to really, when you talk about regenerative, to really have a good, healthy soil and do things, it gives you a lot more flexibility than no water. And then the thing that's just recently dawned on me is the importance of soil health. So I didn't know this, but only the average American farm field has 3 to 6% organic matter. So people wonder why people come to the West and these ranches are so valuable. Well, you're looking at some of these ranches have 6 to 12% organic matter. So I don't think people are asking the right questions when they're valuing land. They're not asking how much water there is. And I have yet to see a ranch listed where the soil sample, so when there's a series of soil samples that say how much organic matter is in that soil. So um, that's another thing I look at value. If you have money and you're looking to buy a ranch, you should first ask for the water rights, the certificates, because I've actually called ranch brokers that ask them about water rights. They have no clue. They don't even know how to look them up, and they'll say, "Well, if you want that, that's something you should get." That should be a basic service. Now, if you're buying a ranch and you have the money to invest in it, then you should get soil samples before you ever buy that place. You should see what your microbiome life is, what your organic life is, and you should understand what your where your nitrogen cycle is, if that's healthy or if it's degraded. Because this is the one thing that I think is going to become a big deal. Carbon sequestration is a big deal. Carbon's a natural building block of life. It's a hot topic because it has to do with climate change. But we look at it, that is not a holistic way to look at things. A lot of people in regenerative agriculture are so focused on carbon, they're leaving a lot of the other critical elements that make up healthy soil out. And one of the most critical elements of soil is a functioning organic nitrogen system. And a lot of these places that you look at that are these elaborate pastures, especially down in Uruguay, Brazil, New Zealand, Australia, that is all supported and propped up by synthetic nitrogen, which completely disrupts the functioning of the soil.
How does it disrupt it?
So the synthetic nitrogen has a tendency to limit the amount that the fungal network, mycelium network, can interact with the plants. It's almost like it creates a barrier on the roots, and those fungal networks can't attach to that root. And the plant will grow faster, but it won't suck up the nutrients because it doesn't have access to that network. And there's just some really fascinating stuff on it. I just got turned on to, I knew about the breakdown of the organic nitrogen system in a lot of agriculture operations. And now that I'm understanding it more, I think that it is more or as important as your organic matter and your carbon that's in your soil. And when you're killing your microbiome in your soil using synthetics or hindering it in any way, you're actually suppressing that soil from becoming everything that it can become. So when I say if you want to buy a ranch, pay the money and get the soil samples and get a good selection of them so you know where you're at. And the other good news about that is if you buy a place with good water and low soil samples and you get a hell of a bargain on it, you have a lot of room for potential to improve that land and really raise the value of it. So there might be some really great opportunities out there that nobody's seen because it doesn't have the aesthetic value, but it might have a low barrier to where to start with improving the soil, but plenty of water. And then there's just a whole lot of stuff you can do.
With the whole topic of nitrogen too and synthetic fertilizers, what would be the alternative to not using, say, a synthetic nitrogen for fertilizer? Like
The
if
natural,
you oh, go ahead.
if the natural system's functioning, and this is what I learned with my last round of soil samples and the experience I did. If you're putting that organic matter back in, that's by like mashing your grasses back in that the cattle aren't eating and having the cattle defecating and urinating, and that organic process of breaking down is happening and your organic nitrogen system is healthy, it'll replenish itself. But when you
That's
get it disruptive, you have a tendency, they talk about 5 years to get that cycle back after just one application of a synthetic nitrogen.
wow. That's wild. 5 years.
Yeah, and there's places that have been doing it for decades. Like if you ever read Nicole Masters' book, she starts out about talking about like the addiction in Australia and New Zealand have on nitrogen, synthetic nitrogen.
Is it? I guess why for example those two places, why do they use so much of that?
Um, So there was an interesting thing that happened. There's a really great book. I can't think of it. Um, I'll text it to you if I can find it. It's about these two different processes of agriculture. There's this one where you're very chemically input. You grow a lot of food. You can feed a lot of people. And then there's the other philosophy where you keep it very natural. It limits the amount of food you can grow, but it's healthier, more nutrient dense. Um, before non-organic nitrogen, we used to use bat guano, and at one time, like bat guano was this huge economy, and they just stripped these islands where these bats and these birds had defecated. And then they'd take that and they'd use it to to add nitrogen to soils. That was organic, but it was a limited resource. And then eventually they figured out how to synthesize um, or nitrogen, but it didn't quite have that same input. But in the meantime, everybody got really addicted to using nitrogen because immediately see these boosts in yield and outcomes. But what nobody's realizing is this is probably when you talk about our food system and how it's changed. We aren't putting the nutrient density back into the plants like we did before. Every time we add a synthetic nitrogen, we are growing a plant really fast and we're not pulling the nutrients out of the soil that we're capable of pulling out. The plant is done growing before it's finished its process or its harvest before it's got that nutrients out. A healthy organic nitrogen system is going to take a lot longer, but grow you a much more nutrient dense plant. And what I worry about, or what I'm really thinking about now is if I'm growing the most nutrient dense plant I can, then how is that translated into my beef? And am I giving my customers something that is might be more money, but ultimately something healthier that is giving them more nutrients?
Yeah, that actually had Dan Kittredge from Bionutrient Institute on my podcast. We talked about this very thing on his research of what makes food more nutrient dense, and it came down to the organic matter. Um, and that's just huge, obviously, with the fact that I remember when I worked on a farm in I worked on a farm in rural Pennsylvania in the fall of 2022. It was my first time ever experiencing rural America and just really being on a farm. And I just remember all the kinds of tomatoes I would see. I mean, they just looked like Frankenstein tomatoes, but those were just natural. And I remember going into the local grocery store. I think it was just the typical Roma tomatoes, and they all were just this shiny red. They all looked the same. And I can guarantee the taste would be nothing even remotely close to those tomatoes on the farm. And there's a lot of truth as to why. And that's, we hear about it all the time too, comparing the nutrient density of like an orange compared to the early 1900s, to where you have to eat, I don't know, 5 6 oranges just to get the same nutrient content of the orange 100 years ago. And it's just crazy how a lot of the food and produce that's in stores, especially the more conventionally raised produce, it's just the taste of it's so bland a lot of times. I mean, I went to get grapes this past weekend, and there's really no taste at all to it. It's just wild how we have this fruit that actually tastes incredible, and there's literally no taste to it. And it's just wild how it's kind of where we've come to be now. And going back to the topic of just nitrogen, it increases the yield of it all. With I'm a capitalist at heart, and I truly love America, but with max yields, max efficiency, and max profits, the thing that has been taken out is nutrient density, but just the taste and overall quality of that piece of food.
That sort of brings up two things. So I managed a ranch in Russia, about 4,400 head, and they had just came in and put in some farm fields, and it was part of Russia that before World War II was part of Germany. And the German before World War II, their agriculture endeavors were insane. It had really great drainage, but after World War II, and Russia got this region, they hadn't kept up that German um, infrastructure. So the Russians decided that they were going to import a bunch of cattle from the United States, Australia, Canada, Mexico, and New Zealand, and start this huge Russian cow herd. And it was when I left, it was over 240,000 head
Oh my
from different places around Russia. We were in this really unique location up on the Baltic Sea. It was about the same elevation as Edmonton. So really cold winters, but I don't know how many people have been to Eugene on the West Coast. It's just this really mild, really, it's called the Willamette Valley. They grow wine there and everything. In the summer and spring and fall, it was like the Willamette Valley, but cold like Edmonton. It was crazy. But I think it was that Baltic effect. But the interesting thing I learned there that really got me paying attention was they'd come in and farmed all these fields for pasture for these cattle to go on to after the winter. And we got into buying, they miscalculated how much feed we were going to need for the winter. So we ran out of feed. And getting feed for cattle in Russia is not something that the infrastructure is set up for. But we had this, each ranch, there's three ranches in the little region I was at. They're about 22 hectares, 22,000 hectares apiece, which is about 40,000 acres. And so we had these cattle. They're in these winter pens, and we've been feeding them hay and silage and different things. And we ended up turning the cattle onto the ranch to sort of forage for themselves. And the winter was dying down. The worst of it was over. So we started turning them out into the fields so that they could get the roughage that they needed and support their calves. And the interesting thing that I found is they wanted us to stay off of the freshly farmed pastures, which was fine. There was plenty of unfarmed pastures in this 40,000 acres. So I would move during this late winter and early spring. I would move my cattle around the non cultivated pastures with the new pastures in them, and they would eat the old residual places that used to be crops left over from World War II that had native growing back in with a little bit of mix with whatever the Germans had planted that kept sustaining over all those decades. And it was really good feed, and they really started picking up. So towards the end of spring, they said, "All right, you can go onto this first pasture, and you should put this big cattle on it." It was about 400 to 500 acres. I put my 500 head, and the cattle just ate it down. No nutritional value, just went in and went out. And they're like, "You're supposed to stay there for 2 weeks." I said, "Feed was gone in 5 days. They decimated." I said, "I'm going back to the old pastures that haven't been cultivated yet because that's where the nutrition is." So it's this interesting thing. We It really taught me a lesson about nature. Sometimes if you just don't disrupt it too much, you actually have a better environment than if you think about it from the 50s to the mid 2000s. They had grazed it slightly, and with their dairy, each community, little community, I had four villages in my ranch, and they each had a little dairy herd. Some of them had 20 head of dairy cows, some of them had 60. But one person from the village would go out every day, and they would graze a new place with with the uh, the dairy animals. They didn't have enough to graze 20,000 acres though, but they spot grazed it, and they had their places that were really prime, and because they'd come back to them year after year. And man, when I started going through that older stuff that they didn't take the dairy cattle to, my cattle would eat it. It would grow back, and I could come back and run the cattle across it, and they would get another shot at it. And it changed the whole. It didn't unwild it by any means. Although we didn't disrupt any of the wildlife was there. There was these things like a cross between a mule deer and an elk there, and I think they're stags, but I'm sure they have some sort of actual name. I just never learned it. But and there was wild pigs, all sorts of birds. There was fish in every pond. And the villages just sort of randomly, there was no property lines or anything. They existed within my ecosystem of my ranch. And one of the biggest shocks was they would burn. We woke up one day, late spring, early summer. It was still pretty wet. It was still raining occasionally, and they were burning thousands of acres of fields. Just that's what they'd always done. And so we had to go explain to all the villages, we need to coordinate these birds with you because we may have cows where you're burning. They never even thought of it because they've been doing it this way for so many years. And it was just, but it was a good lesson in what actually, where are the actual nutrients? The cultivated stuff, it would have come along in 3 or 4 years as it got established, but it's very fragile in the beginning. That stuff that hadn't been disrupted for 4 decades, there was some real value, nutritional value in that stuff. So when I look at ranching and I'm nudging my own ecosystem around, I keep that in the back of my mind. I'm just now thinking about no tilling some more variety and diversity into some of my pastures. I don't know that I have to do it, but I was at a regenerative conference with some pretty smart scientists that talked about soil. And the more diversity that you can get within an acre, the more that microcilium network establishes itself, the more it spreads itself, the more one plant will take a resource from another plant to grow, but give back that plant something that it needs. And as long as you have more diversity, you have that web that allows you to get that nutrients out of the ground.
Gabe Brown talks about that a lot. I've noticed from the very beginning was a lot of plant diversity.
It's, I don't know how deep you want to get, but I've been thinking a lot about the evolution, and I'm taking myself back all the way before Savory to the guy that came up with holism, the idea of holism, and the whole and the parts within the whole was African, South African. He was an English guy that was there in South Africa, and he started seeing a lot of what I saw and realizing that you gotta. Here's an interesting thing: each individual part within a whole is its own thing, but when you put it in the whole, that whole becomes something completely different. So you can't manage. You can manage the individual parts of a whole, but you're influencing what the whole looks like. That's an entire system, and we um, don't really. We're just now through regenerative agriculture, and like I said, I've been really learning this stuff for a decade. We're just starting to hit the. We're just starting to realize what we don't know. And Gabe Brown built on Savory. He built on smolts. I think I'm going back. I'm studying Lassiter. Like I have the Lassiter philosophy of raising cattle on my desk here because it's one of my things. I also always within arm's reach is Savory's holistic resource management. Gabe Brown's book Dirt to Soil is probably one of the best things that came out. Um, Nicole Masters' book For the Love of Soil is an amazing book. And then there's this really great professor in southern Utah that just retired named Fred Provenza, and he wrote Nourishment, which also plays into this, but more in that wild setting like I experienced in Russia. And we are just now learning what we have forgotten over generations. And in regenerative agriculture, there is no, I'm convinced that there's no one size fits all. And if you follow Gabe Brown, you'll realize after he put out Dirt to Soil, he actually went back and put out a second edition. There was originally 9 components that Gabe wanted to focus on, like keeping roots in the soil, keeping cover on the ground, keeping animals in the system, and multiple different types of animals, and including plant diversity. But the one thing that he added back was context. Where are you at? How much water do you get? So when I look at Will Harris, who I think is brilliant, and he has this really great post on his blog called "The Difference Between Complicated and Complex," and we operate in humans' minds can only really do the complicated. Complex is multifaceted. It's that pieces of the whole, and then the whole being different. And context is so important because I think the world of Will Harris, but he gets 76 inches of rain a year in Georgia. Where I ranch, I get 7 inches of rain a year.
Oh my god.
So the way I manage water is much different. He has an abundance, I have a scarcity. I'm sure that I have abundances and he has scarcities that balance that. And Gabe Brown's scarcity and abundances are different. And so you have to have context. So one of the things I find most frustrating about people that, and I'm encouraging them, I want them to be successful. I want them, people that are coming to regenerative agriculture, I think that understanding context is key. Because if you're trying to take something that Will Harris is doing in Georgia and apply it to something that's happening in Austin, Texas, it's not going to work because you have totally different context within which to. So you really have to look at your system, the natural systems around you, and then build what you think your system should be based on that. And so context is key. So I think the biggest insight in Gabe's book is that he went back and he added that component.
With that being said, then I'm curious because going back to mentioning on the discussion of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, and that brings up the higher yields but less quality and less nutrient dense food versus regenerative agriculture, to where it increases the cost. It is more timely, but or it takes longer, but you're producing more nutrient dense food. Do you think regenerative agriculture is scalable, or is that even the right question to be asking?
That's all I think about. My biggest gripe when I go to conferences is, and I have a big mouth and I get myself in a lot of problems, but to and once again, I'm very supportive of the regenerative community. But what you do on a 20-acre ranch or farm is much different than what somebody that has 2,000 acres of wheat is going to do. Is regenerative possible on 2,000 acres of wheat? There's a guy in Montana. I wish I could remember his name. He's been doing it for 2 decades. Extremely successful. There's a lot of really smart people that are transferring large acreages and really complex ecosystems into regenerative agriculture. And they so often are so busy or introverts or whatever. They're not like myself. They're not out there advocating for regenerative agriculture because they just live in their own little context. And they're doing amazing things on scale, and we just aren't learning about it.
Because that's my, above all else, one of my, I guess, worries I have with agriculture is the fact that the average age of the farmer and rancher continues to increase. The fact that younger generations aren't working in agriculture. I mean, a lot of younger generations, their dream growing up is YouTube and TikTok and all kinds of other social media outlets. And it makes sense whenever you think about it and you zoom out and look at the economics and the labor, to where you could be making a decent living sitting it on your ass all day with like a virtual assistant or some type of job, rather than doing backbreaking work on a farm that you might not even be getting paid that much. It's very difficult to try to sway that person into be thinking about agriculture and starting their own ranch. Because that's why I have Regenaissance, is trying to build these communities, and have these conversations as a way to help with this problem, in my opinion. And that's just the fact that a lot don't have an heir that they're going to be giving their land to. So what's going to happen to that land whenever it's put up for sale? Is it going to be taken up by like BlackRock or other players like that? Or is it taken by someone else that has no idea about agriculture and they do nothing with the land and it just degrades? Yeah, that's something I think about a lot, is this topic. And I don't know exactly where I'm going with this, but I would just love to hear your, I guess, just insights on just that topic. How can we help drive new folks in this space?
I think the first choice you have to make is the one that you made. Eventually, sometime you realize that by switching to a different type of diet, by understanding these processes much better, you increase the quality of your life. Probably not in the economic sense that you thought that you did, but your day to day experience from watching your YouTube video, I'm guessing that you found a benefit that improved your lifestyle.
Yeah, for me, I just remember I was figuring out my life after my brother died. I knew I didn't. I worked for IBM. I knew I didn't want to go back to that, and so I guess went on a quote unquote soul search for the next 8 to 10 months. And I just remember this was January of 2022. I was on Twitter and I somehow found my way into like Homestead Regenerative Agriculture Twitter. And that was just my light bulb moment of holy shit, I've been so disconnected from my food. I've never spoken to a rancher or farmer. I buy everything from a grocery store. And so I just kind of started to explore that. And then I just remember, I vividly remember, because I was vegan for 2.5 years. So at the time when I was taking care of my brother, I was vegan. And then that following year, I was not vegan and I visited a ranch in Colorado processing chickens. So I literally went from being vegan to a year later, I was literally chopping heads off of chickens. But I just remember that whole experience, even though I was only there for its final day of that animal, seeing the farm owner, because he did this interesting ritual of just respect for its life. And then actually having that chicken later, because that was kind of the reward that I was given for volunteering was I got a chicken to take home and I grilled that with some friends. And that was there's no looking back after that. And then it just kept compiling more. I visited the next ranch, stayed on that ranch for multiple days, helped out and observed and had that food and those conversations. And then eventually actually worked on a farm. I just kept stockpiling. But it wasn't until making that first decision of actually visiting a ranch and talking to the folks that own it and do all the work really changed my perception. And that's why before our podcast, that's why I was talking about I try to do that as much as possible on social media to push folks to even just go to a farmer's market to have a conversation because you have no idea where that could lead to. You have no idea what you could potentially be missing out on in life because it literally transformed my life in the best way possible. Because even just a side note, why I like agriculture, why to me I'm going to be ranching long term because I want to start my own bison ranch. It's the most fulfilling work. It's very difficult work, very manually labor intensive, but again, it's the most fulfilling work. And I'm a Christian now, which has been the most surprising thing out of everything since losing 2/3 of my family. To me, in God's image, He's made us way more resilient than we realize. And I think being a farmer, being a rancher helps that too, because it builds resiliency. You see God's hand at play, seeing the whole system at play. I mean, going back to your comment saying with your great grandfather, seeing just nature play out. That's why I love regenerative agriculture because you're aligning with nature and seeing how that responds versus conventional tour. That's typically you're working against nature. And how does that respond? The Dust Bowl and so many other great famines and ancient civilizations.
Yeah, if
So,
you read Jared Diamond's book Collapse, you'll find that the thing that normally precipitates a collapse of a society is the complete rejection of the people that are raising their food. It's a it's an interesting thing. We get disconnected, and that's what causes a society to collapse. And I think that we're recognizing that's what's happening in the United States. But we are
and,
a
and,
capital.
and globally, because even just going on the whole plant-based movement, again, because this is also why I'm so outspoken against veganism is because I was one for 2.5 years and it's not rooted in reality at all. We've advanced this far as a civilization on animal protein. We will always advance and thrive as a society through animal protein. There's never been a thriving vegan community. And to me, it's that disconnection piece. I remember I made a video on my Instagram page about a month ago of this farmer talking to a vegan activist, and she's making all these claims of he's raping all of his animals. He's in it. He's making just all kinds of exorbitant amount of money, and he abuses the animals, and just uses them for profits. There's just so much disconnection there. Her heart's in the right place, because that's what my whole thinking is. A lot of vegans, their hearts are in the right place, but they're so disconnected from it all, and that's why I push again for folks to have these conversations with the people that are actually doing the real work in the real world, because you have no idea where it could lead to.
Yeah, it's another thing that I've observed. I just was exposed to. I am McAllister. He wrote a book about the divided brain. And his argument is that we live in a very left brain society. We like to live in boxes. We like to have our temperature controlled. We like to have frameworks. We like to have accounting systems. We like to apply science, see immediate reactions. Um, and when you make the switch to regenerative agriculture, you have to disregard our society's overwhelming desire to be left brained, to live in this structured environment. It makes us comfortable, it makes us easy. When you start looking at the world with a more right brain perspective, overall, that it's the part of the whole and the whole being different than the parts, and you start to see that, your right brain, you switch into sort of a right brain type of living. And that's where you get the Gabe Browns, the Joel Salatins, the Will Harrises, the Alan Savorys. Those people have stepped away from the left brain approach to things, and they've realized that that eliminates that hole. And so it's a very hard transition because we are so programmed to be left brain thinkers that we do not listen to the right brain. And the gentleman that talks about the divided brain says that the left hand side of the brain, when it gets feels discomfort, will actually shut down to seeing these bigger picture things. It's a conflict, and rather than deal with the conflict, it actually like doubles down on that system, that really narrow systems approach. But the right brain, when you start living in that hemisphere of your brain more and it dominates more over the left brain, then you start to see how everything works together and these ecosystems function. And then you can really start to see that you're just a piece in it. You don't really have that much influence over it. And if you exert your influence, that left brain influence into it, you actually start damaging the systems that are naturally there. So I think that the value, it might not be monetarily, but the value is quality of life. And I think that's what everybody's searching for. They can't make that switch to that more holistic right brain type of thinking. And that creates a lot of conflict within our society. Can we all make that switch? I don't know. I think it's left to be unsaid. But his argument is that at certain points in our evolution as Homo sapiens, we have had periods where the right brain was in charge and it sequestered that left brain type of thinking, and that's when we see our biggest leaps as a culture. I would have never. This is 10 years of thinking about regenerative agriculture. We're there. We're starting to realize that our food system is broken. It is not sustainable. They talk about there only being so many more cultivations in sorry,
No, you're fine.
there are so many more times that we can cultivate stuff on the plains in the Midwest because we've depleted our soil that much. We are looking at a huge onslaught of ultra processed foods. and you know this from the Michael Pollan books, you should only be shopping around the perimeter of your store. And you still get those tomatoes like you were talking about, but they're still better than what you get when you shop in those aisles.
Yep.
You need to eat more whole food. We all need to be eating more whole foods, less processed. And then you get into this whole information society and dopamine processing and manipulating the dopamine hits that we get. And we're doing that through our food, like we did it with the cigarettes. And people will push back on me all this time, but whether it's conscious or subconscious, we have created our food to give us a dopamine hit rather than give us the nutrition that we need.
Well, it's funny you bring up the cigarette because a lot of the cigarette companies moved on to the food.
Yeah, he, the guy that did John, I can't wrote. He's the guy that produced Kiss the Ground. He's a big proponent of this, and he's constantly pounding on LinkedIn about like showing the connections of the web of ultra processed food and all the different corporations that are in this, and it's
Mhm.
all for profit. I tend to not think that there's any grand design to get there. It just naturally evolves that way because we're so locked into this left brain thinking, and we got to feed people and we got to give them cheap food. Politicians don't get elected because food prices are high. I mean, one of the biggest strains and one of the biggest conflict points we have right now is inflation has pushed the price of food up so much. And now people are paying for food that doesn't have any nutritional value. And whether they realize it or not, it's not a safe thing. Anytime you attack somebody's food, I think it's in our DNA. We do not, we are very conscious and very sensitive to our water supply and our food supply. And regardless of whether we are rationally seeing it, subconsciously, we know something's amiss. And we don't, a lot of people haven't figured out, like you have, what's amiss. But the thing is that the society's starting to wake up to the fact that our food has been so diluted that it's causing all these other marginal reactions like rising healthcare costs, mental illness, um, just our general health and well-being. Like we were talking before the podcast, I made some very simple changes to my diet, and it's improved my quality of life considerably. And you've been on the same journey, and it's all it's all these pieces of this whole, and I think we're
I'm curious. This is the last thing I want to talk about. It's going back to, it pertains to what you just said, but your experience with Russia, because it's funny that you brought that up. I'm just started reading, crap, I think it's called The Great Famine. I think that's what it's called. It's on Holdemore and just the history of all of that. And so I'd be curious whenever, well, first, how are you able to get that whole Russia experience with such a large, it seemed like there's just a really large operation. How did that even come to be?
I was long story. I'll shorten it. When we got kicked off the ranch that my grandfather built, we moved our cattle to Nevada, and we were just barely getting together. And I have two sisters; they have husbands and they have kids. So for 10 years, I was in the oil field in North Dakota, and in the middle of that is when I went to Russia. Um, and uh, darn, I lost my thread. Sorry. Oh, yeah. God dang it. What was the question? Sorry.
Just how did it came to be to just this whole
Oh,
Russian
yeah.
operation?
So I was dating this girl in Whitehall, Montana. She had this beautiful ranch, um, and her father had invented a vaccine that every chicken in the world needs to have. But he was an introvert. He hated being the CEO of the company. He invented this vaccine, and was just the money was it was just coming because everybody needed to buy it. He didn't want to manage the whole thing, so he stepped down as the CEO and and got paid out and moved to Montana to start this ranch. And that's what he loved to do. Collected his royalties. So I was dating her and I was helping them on the ranch. They had 300 of the nicest purebred Angus cattle you'd ever seen. And some guys from Russia came to her and they wanted to buy all her heifers and put them on a barge and ship them over to Russia. She didn't sell them, but she told me about these Russians that had come to visit them and look at their cattle. I was fascinated about it. So I got on LinkedIn and I just started searching and I started finding all these Americans that had gone over to this beef project in Russia. And I just started emailing them. And the guy I started emailing with was really accommodating, and I had sent him a bunch of questions and he'd answer it. And then I just couldn't help myself. So I'd send him some more questions and he was very patient and he answered those. At about the third round of this, he answered all my questions at the end of the email. He just said, "Do you just want a job?" And I was like, "Yeah." And so 30 days later, I was on a plane and went to Russia.
Oh my gosh, that's a that's a hell of a story.
Yeah, the girl in Whitehall, that didn't happen, but yeah, no, that it completely changed the trajectory of my life. Being in Russia was extremely difficult. I absolutely adore and love the Russian people. They are probably the most stoic, kindest people you'll ever meet, as long as it's not between 9 and 5. I like and working with Russians. You may be too young to remember this Looney Tunes cartoon with the sheepdog and the coyote,
Hmm.
and they grab their lunch bales in the beginning of the day and they trudge off to work and they clock in. And before they clock in, they were the best of buddies. They were slapping each other on the back, and they'd clock in, and then the coyote would go to killing the sheep, and the sheepdog would go to protecting the sheep. And it was this thing. And then they'd have lunch, and they'd clock out. They'd sit and have their lunch, and then they clock back in, and they'd go at it again. And at the end of the day, they'd walk off together, arm in arm, and it would start over again. And that's a lot like what it's like working in Russia. From 9 to 5, they're ruthless, but they leave that all at the door. When they clock out, they want you to come to their house, even though they were trying to screw you all day. They want you to come to their house, meet their family, eat their food, visit, and have a good time. And you're the best of buds. And the next day at 9 o'clock, you go to work, and they're trying to take you down again. It's the weirdest thing I've ever been. And being an American, my brain wasn't ready for that. And so it was a really difficult process for me trying to, because I wasn't there to take anybody's job. I was there to sort of consult and to teach them how to manage cattle and like the basics of moving them from pasture to pasture. I had a crew of 6 or 7 guys that were horseback, and we basically were just there to take care of the cattle. The other politics that were with it was overwhelming. And so after 8 months, it just broke down and jumped on a plane and came back home. But the time that I was there, almost a year, I just learned so much. I just had so much opportunity in this lab, and it was just fascinating because nobody knew what they were doing. We were trying to build something on the fly, and it was fascinating. And yeah, I'm always thankful, and I'm always thankful to those guys that even though during the day they tried to screw me, that I learned a lot in that process. And um, it was really a lot of teamwork, even though it didn't seem like it at the time. But and they still struggle. They're still struggling. Um, the phenomenon of large scale beef is very much an American concept that was imported back to Russia. So it's this weird dynamic, and so we really founded the West and a lot of America based on the movement of large herds of cattle in the magnificent destiny. And like the railroads, as they built railroads, they built loading processes so they could send cattle back to Chicago. And that's one of the reasons why it was financed. And a lot of America and that westward expansion was on the back of cattle. And there was there's a really great book called The Red Beef Republic, and the amount of speculation in the beginning that went into American cattle herds, lots of people lost lots of money trying to figure it out. And so you can imagine Russians on a smaller scale are learning those same lessons. And their large scale cattle operations are going to look different than what Americans do, but that culture is changing the way that Russians do food. Because I think they're up, last I heard, I think they're up to 640,000 head of cattle.
Oh my gosh.
And the way it was set up when I left was that each little ranch was about 40,000 acres and it had about 4,000 head of cattle.
I get my final question then. What does, this is going to be a very broad question. What does agriculture mean to you?
There's a thing that I will always preach, and it's that all wealth comes from the land. You can't, and this is all natural resources. It's our food, it's our computer chips, it's our lithium batteries. Everything that we built everything on comes from some natural resource. And so not only does agriculture mean everything to me, it means everything to everybody else. There is no, we can't eat ones and zeros. We can't eat the binary computer systems, software systems that we develop. We can't sustain ourselves on that. That is all anchored back to the natural resources and the people that work in natural resources. I mean, I have lots of people that argue with me that they're creating all this wealth with Microsoft and Google and all that stuff. The simple fact is none of that exists if we can't feed ourselves, if we don't have good water supplies. We can't build skyscrapers without the cement that we harvest from mines. We can't build iPhones without the natural elements that go into the computer chips to make up those things. Our whole system is based on our natural resources. And I think that this is one thing that I've observed. I think that agriculture land is seeing these huge increase in values that is sort of unprecedented because a lot of people sort of dismissed agriculture as, you know, those hayseed farmers out there, the rural, unrefined people that gave us our food, but they didn't realize that the agriculture is setting on the majority of wealth that's in the United States. And the other exception are the mines, the timber companies. And so it's this, everything that is the United States is our natural resources. So when you ask me what agriculture means to me, agriculture means everything for everybody.
I like that a lot. So thank you for joining. I love this conversation. I guess before we go, if there's anything that you would like to plug, this would be a good time
Nope.
for that. Perfect.
I'm always open for conversations. I'm really accessible. I answer most everybody, and I'm always open for people if they want to make the trip out to southeastern Oregon to this little rural paradise I live in. I'll take the time and show you around. And if you want to see what kind of regenerative ranching that I do, I'm more than happy to invest the time so that I can share that with you. I've talked to most anybody. So, anyways, that's my pitch. I'm perfectly good. I'm not trying to sell anybody anything or anything. I'm just trying to advocate for these people that are doing agriculture, that are mining, that are getting our energy, that are doing the timber. They have been forgotten, and they need somebody to speak up and say, "Hey, we're important here too, and we actually help everybody else prosper. So keep us propped up so that everybody else can keep going forward."
Amen. Thank you. Visit www.theregenaissance.co to learn more.